Imagine, if you will, a village blanketed in frost. Not a gentle frost, but one that arrived early, lingered long, and returned year after year with deepening insistence. The trees, once full with autumn colour, now stand stripped and brittle beneath a sky that rarely softens. A young boy, barefoot and pale, waits in silence as his father digs through the snow-covered earth, searching not for treasure, but for roots. In this quiet corner of the world, tucked somewhere between the Black Forest and the Carpathian Mountains, life in the early 1600s begins to slip between the cracks of a frozen century. The fires burn low, and so too do the hopes of many who live through this time, a time when death arrives not with trumpet calls or thunderous armies, but with slow hunger, bitter wind, and the collapse of rhythms once taken for granted. The 17th century is not usually the one we think of when we imagine global catastrophe. The 20th has its world wars, the 14th its plague. But the 1600s, strangely quiet in our collective memory, were, by many counts, the most devastating of them all. It was a time when the world trembled under the weight of converging pressures. The skies grew colder, the fields yielded less, and political orders frayed at the seams. Empires teetered, faiths were tested, and all across the globe, people died in such numbers that entire regions lost memory of what stability once felt like. In some areas, more than a third of the population disappeared within a generation. Yet this was not a single disaster. It was a chorus of calamities, overlapping and compounding, until survival itself became a kind of resistance. We begin this journey not in the halls of kings or the corridors of scientific discovery, but in the quiet places, the edges of farms, the dim chapels and wind-worn markets. For it is there that history truly lives, and where the deadliest century made its most lasting marks. This is not the history of conquerors alone, though there were many. It is the history of children who disappeared into plague pits, of monks who recorded snowfall long into spring, of travellers who wandered empty roads in search of food. It is the story of a planet in flux, and the millions of lives reshaped by that subtle, cruel movement. Climate lies at the heart of the tale, though it hides beneath the surface of many events. The period now known as the Little Ice Age had begun centuries earlier, but it reached a chilling crescendo in the 1600s. Glaciers advanced, rivers froze, crop failures became routine. In France, vineyards withered. In China, the Yellow River swelled and swallowed farmland. In North Africa, rains failed to fall. Famine spread, not suddenly but steadily. A creeping affliction that hollowed villages and filled graves with the very old, the very young, and the very poor. Hunger became a shared language, whispered across continents. Some adapted, others fled. Many died, and still, the cold endured. But weather alone cannot explain the scale of the collapse. What makes this century particularly haunting is how the natural and the human so tragically converged. As crops failed, wars ignited. As economies strained, revolts grew. As states faltered, diseases spread unchecked. The 30 Years' War would devastate Central Europe for a generation. In China, the Ming dynasty would fall into rebellion and ruin. The Mughal Empire, though rich and radiant, began to strain under its own weight. The Ottomans struggled to pay their soldiers. The Safavids faced drought and destabilization. And far across the oceans, indigenous societies in the Americas reeled under the long tail of conquest and foreign disease. No region remained untouched. No people were truly spared. What makes the 1600s uniquely sorrowful and worthy of such quiet contemplation is not only its suffering but its forgotten nature. We do not often speak of it. There are no blockbuster films about this century. Few school books linger here. It was, in many ways, a century erased, not by accident, but by the uncomfortable truth it presents. That progress is not inevitable, and that entire generations can be consumed by forces beyond comprehension. And yet, within this darkness, people endured. They sang, they wrote, they prayed, they tried. This is not only a tale of collapse, but of perseverance, not of endings, but of fragile continuance in a cold and changing world. In the chapters to come, we will drift from place to place, as softly as falling snow. We'll listen to the winds that carried soldiers through broken cities, and the silence that followed after. We'll warm our hands at the fires of scholars, rebels, mothers, and monks, all those who bore witness to a century both terrible and strangely beautiful in its human resilience. Let us now step deeper into that forgotten time and feel what it meant to live within the deadliest century you've never heard of. In the softened dawn of a 17th century morning, the earth no longer holds the warmth it once did. Across Europe, the dew clings longer to stiff blades of grass. In the Andean highlands, the thin air bites with a cold that arrives weeks too soon. And in the plains of Asia, where rice once grew in abundance, the season now slips askew. Something subtle yet colossal has shifted, and though no one can yet name it, the sky is telling a different story than before. The sun feels dimmer, the winds seem restless, and the rhythm of the seasons, so long relied upon, begins to stagger. Historians today call this period the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling of the Earth's climate that reached a sharp and punishing intensity during the 1600s. It was not an ice age in the sense of glaciers swallowing continents, but it was ice enough. Winters grew longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. Summers became unreliable. In Scandinavia, fishing communities found their coastlines frozen solid. In England, the Thames froze over repeatedly, thick enough for frost fairs, where tents, fires, and even puppet shows played out atop the unmoving river. It was quaint on the surface, almost festive, but beneath the laughter, there was anxiety. Because if a river could freeze that had never frozen before, what else might change? The causes of the Little Ice Age remain, even now, a tapestry of theories. Volcanic eruptions likely darkened the skies with sulfur and ash, dimming solar radiation. Sunspot activity declined, reducing solar energy. And with the combination of altered ocean currents and atmospheric shifts, the result was a world tilted subtly, but decisively, toward cold. Yet while the temperature drop may seem slight by modern standards, its consequences were anything but. Agriculture in the early modern world was exquisitely sensitive to seasonal variation. A late frost could ruin entire harvests. A cool, wet summer could rot the grain in the field. And with no industrial supply chains to fall back on, the people of the 17th century were held fast in the arms of the weather. In rural France, the grape harvest faltered. Vineyards that had once supported families for generations now yielded thin and bitter wine, if they yielded anything at all. In the Alps, glaciers advanced, swallowing farmland and even entire villages. The ice moved so slowly that it seemed to crawl, but it did not stop. In Iceland, volcanic activity combined with cold years to devastate crops and livestock, pushing local populations to the brink. And in Russia, the so-called Time of Troubles, a period of dynastic crisis and famine, was worsened by the failure of seasonal norms. People ate bark, leather, and eventually each other. These were not isolated tragedies. They were echoes, ringing out across the hemisphere. In China, the effects of the Little Ice Age played out with subtle devastation. The Yellow River, often called China's Sorrow, flooded with terrible frequency as changing snowmelt patterns collided with crumbling infrastructure. Elsewhere, droughts afflicted entire provinces. The Qinghai-Tibet Plateau, once hospitable for pastoralists, saw advancing permafrost and shrinking grasslands. Livelihoods disappeared beneath the cold. In many places, officials wrote reports to the emperor describing strange and frightening weather. Summer hailstorms, rivers that froze solid in southern latitudes, or crops that refused to ripen. As the climate grew harsher, unrest began to simmer. Hungry people are rarely quiet for long, but it was not only hunger that emerged. Alongside the physical toll came psychological dread. When patterns fail, beliefs begin to shake. In much of Europe, failing crops were often seen as the wrath of God. People turned to fasting, to penance, to persecution. Witch trials spiked in years of poor harvest. It was not uncommon for desperate communities to seek out scapegoats, women, outsiders, or those marked by misfortune, and blame them for weather that could not be understood. In a world without meteorology, the mysteries of the sky felt terrifying and personal. The chill in the wind was not just cold, it was punishment, omen, or divine correction. Even cities, buffered by trade and governance, could not escape. Grain prices rose rapidly in urban centres, leading to food riots and quiet starvation among the poor. In London, Paris, and Amsterdam, the price of bread doubled or tripled in bad years. In smaller towns, there was no bread at all. In parts of Germany, people dug into anthills for seeds left by insects. In Scandinavia, they boiled lichens into bitter porridge. And still, the cold came. Yet through all of this, people found ways to adapt, some clever, some cruel. New strains of crops were cultivated. Trade networks shifted to chase more stable climates. And within families, traditions began to reflect the uncertainty of the seasons. In some alpine communities, children were taught to expect hunger as a normal part of winter. In Japan, where the Tokugawa shogunate would soon stabilize the country, communities began practicing frugality and stockpiling in anticipation of bad years. Slowly, painfully, cultures responded to the deepening uncertainty. But always, the cold remained. What the Little Ice Age teaches, above all, is that change need not be sudden to be catastrophic. The 1600s did not freeze the world in a single night. It was the slowness of it that made it deadly. A gentle, persistent tilt away from the balance of life. And as we drift deeper into this century of quiet disaster, the effects of that cold will continue to ripple outward, not only through fields and forests, but into the hearts of empires and the minds of those who ruled them. There are wars that are remembered for their thunder, and others for their silence. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, unfolded somewhere in between, not as a single sweeping campaign, but as a drawn-out erosion of Europe's middle. It began with a window, or rather the act of throwing someone out of one. In the high halls of Prague Castle, Protestant nobles hurled 2 Catholic officials from a second-story window in what would later be called the Defenestration of Prague. Remarkably, the officials survived the fall, but the fragile balance of power in the Holy Roman Empire did not. What followed was not one war, but many. A web of entangled conflicts, fueled by faith, ambition, vengeance, and the slow unraveling of medieval order. To walk through Central Europe in the 1620s or 1630s was to pass through a continent unmaking itself. Villages once alive with song and harvest were reduced to ash and thistle. Armies moved with no fixed allegiance, often fighting not for cause, but for survival. Mercenaries, sometimes unpaid, often undisciplined, pillaged the land for food, for coin, for distraction. Crops were trampled under boots. Churches were stripped bare. The difference between soldier and bandit became increasingly difficult to name. For the people caught in the middle, there was no real side to take, only sides to avoid. The war had begun as a struggle between Catholic and Protestant powers in the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, but faith was only the first layer. Beneath it lay dynastic ambition, regional rivalries, and the delicate dance of European balance. Spain, France, Sweden, the Dutch Republic, and numerous German principalities all became entangled, their motivations as varied as their flags. It was a conflict of shifting alliances, temporary truces, and bitter betrayals. A war that spread like fire across dry grass, sometimes flaring hot, sometimes smouldering in embers, but never truly extinguished for 3 long decades. For civilians, the war became a slow kind of death. In many regions of modern-day Germany, populations declined by 30 to 50%. Some towns vanished completely from the map, their names remembered only in tax records and church logs. The reasons were not just battle. Far more often, it was disease, hunger, and the loss of community that killed. When armies passed through, they took livestock, tools, and even roofing timbers. What remained was seldom enough to survive. Fields were left fallow, families scattered. The countryside began to resemble a graveyard stretched over miles. Refugees flooded into cities, bringing tales of smoke and silence. But the cities too began to collapse under the weight. Overcrowding bred disease. The economy withered as trade routes crumbled. Inflation devoured savings, and the once bustling marketplaces turned thin and quiet. Even the nobility suffered. Castles were looted. Courts moved from place to place, seeking safety that never truly arrived. A sense of unraveling permeated everything. The world felt, to many, as though it were ending, not in fire or divine fury, but in a slow, aching disintegration of all that once made life predictable. What makes the 30 Years' War so elusive in our memory is precisely this: its shapelessness. Unlike the clean lines of battlefield histories, this war was a murky, overlapping fog. There were moments of grandeur, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus charging into battle, or the Catholic League's sweeping early victories, but these were islands in a sea of attrition. Much of the violence was personal, local, and anonymous. A burned barn, a stolen cart, a girl taken and never returned. It was a war without a neat narrative, and perhaps that is why it rarely finds its way into textbooks with the same clarity as Waterloo or the Somme. Yet despite its ambiguity, the 30 Years' War left deep scars. It altered the map of Europe, both literally and metaphorically. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, would establish the idea of sovereign states, a turning point in the evolution of the modern nation. But that peace came at a cost. Millions dead, economies shattered, and a generation haunted by sights no theology could fully explain. The war had begun as a dispute over religion, but by its end, few had faith in anything at all. And still, life continued. Slowly, tentatively, people returned to the land. Fields were ploughed once more, churches rebuilt. Children born after the war grew up hearing only whispers of its horrors, half-remembered tales of winter fires and soldiers with no country. But beneath the surface of rebuilding, something had shifted. The war had changed what people expected from the world. Certainty, once a given, now seemed a luxury. And in the quiet years that followed, Europe would carry that uncertainty forward into its politics, its philosophies, and its dreams of a new order. As we drift further through the 1600s, we will see how the trauma of this war echoed into the hearts of other lands, and how, even in the aftermath of so much devastation, the human impulse to adapt and rebuild remained as steady as ever. Across the frost-hardened plains of early modern Europe, a strange and unsettling figure became a common sight: the wandering soldier. Clad in ragged leathers or patched remnants of once grand uniforms, he carried a musket slung over one shoulder and hunger etched deep into his eyes. Sometimes he traveled alone, muttering to himself beneath a threadbare hood. Other times he drifted with a pack, a band of men bound not by country or creed, but by the simple need to survive. These were the mercenaries of the 30 Years' War, the floating remnants of shattered armies, men who no longer fought for a flag, but for food, fire, and fleeting safety. As the war dragged on through the 1620s and 1630s, its armies became less armies in the traditional sense and more like roaming populations. Once enlisted with the promise of coin or plunder, many of these men found themselves cut off from any clear command. Payments lapsed, officers disappeared. The bureaucracies that had once fed and clothed them broke down under the weight of constant conflict. And so, with no orders and no wages, they turned instead to the land, not to defend it, but to take from it whatever it could still give. In the forests of Bohemia, peasants told stories of these soldiers like folktales. They arrived suddenly, with smoke and shouting. They stripped barns, overturned altars, and sometimes left whole villages behind them in smouldering silence. Yet not all were cruel by choice. Many were young, many were hungry. Some had once been cobblers or farmers, pressed into service by force or desperation. Now they wandered through frozen valleys and ravaged towns, searching not for glory, but for a warm place to sleep. The war had given them a role. When the battle moved on, it left them behind. These soldiers were known by many names: Landsknechte in German lands, Soldati Ventura in the Italian states. But regardless of title, their plight was largely the same. They belonged nowhere. Their weapons were often their only possession. Their uniforms no longer matched. Some switched sides more than once, selling their services to whoever had food or silver to spare. Others became what we would now call deserters, but in truth, they had simply outlived the structure that once gave their violence meaning. They became a kind of human weather, passing across the countryside like storms. Unpredictable, destructive, but always moving. It is easy to judge these men by their deeds. Many committed terrible acts, but to understand the deadliest century properly, one must also see them through the lens of dislocation. The 17th century was a time when institutions collapsed under pressure and people were left to drift through the wreckage. The wandering soldier was not only a symbol of war's violence, but of its failure to end. Long after treaties were signed, these men continued to roam. Some never returned home, either because they no longer had one, or because they no longer believed they could belong to a peaceful world. There are quiet testimonies from this time, scattered in parish records and travelers' journals, of villagers attempting to bribe passing soldiers to move on peacefully. Bread was offered at the edge of town. Cows were left untethered, as silent suggestions. In a few cases, communities tried to absorb the soldiers, offering them roofs, marriages, or labor in exchange for stillness. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. Trust was rare. And in a world where winter could mean starvation, fear often outweighed charity. The psychological cost was immense. For the soldiers and for the people who lived beneath their shadow, the war was not just a matter of battlefields. It became a way of life, a long grey drift where the seasons changed. But the danger did not. Children grew up with the sound of boots in the distance. Elders marked time not by harvests, but by how many times their town had been looted. And for the soldiers themselves, identity blurred. Without allegiance, without routine, many began to lose their sense of self entirely. They became ghosts in the world of the living, figures who walked but did not belong. Yet there were moments of softness even here. A soldier might pause to help a frightened child. He might share a crust of bread with a stranger in the snow. In the margins of war, humanity flickered faintly, if briefly. Some of these men would eventually settle, taking up tools instead of weapons. Others would join future conflicts, unable or unwilling to abandon the only life they had known. And some would disappear entirely, their names lost to time, their footsteps swallowed by mud and snow. As we continue deeper into this century of unrelenting pressure, these wandering soldiers remind us that war does not end at the signing of a treaty, nor does it stay confined to generals and maps. It seeps outward, into roads, homes, dreams, and long after the banners fall, its echoes can still be heard in the footsteps of those left behind. Somewhere between the tall shadows of an abandoned chapel and the sunken remains of stone walls overtaken by moss, there lies the outline of a village, or at least what once was. No road leads here anymore. The fields that once rippled with barley have grown wild with thistle and nettle. The well is dry. The names of those who lived here no longer appear in parish registers. And yet, in the soft curve of an old foundation or the hollow echo beneath a collapsed roof beam, there lingers the memory of life. These were once places of laughter, routine, and quiet continuity. Now, they are among the thousands of villages that quietly disappeared during the 17th century. erased not by fire alone, but by the long pressure of famine, plague, and war. Across Central and Eastern Europe, the disappearance of entire communities was not a rare event, but a pattern that unfolded with haunting consistency. In the German lands, where the 30 Years' War had carved deep scars, entire parishes lost so many residents that they ceased to function. In the region of Mecklenburg alone, more than half of all villages were reduced to rubble or complete abandonment by the war's end. Some vanished over the course of months, others over years. The process was not always dramatic. Often it was simply a matter of people leaving, first a family, then another, until only silence remained. These vanished settlements were not always marked on maps, nor were their losses always mourned with ceremony. The weight of so much death had numbed the rituals of grief. When plague swept through a town, it often killed too quickly for records to be kept. When famine struck, those with the strength to leave did so, while those who remained were often buried where they fell. Over time, weeds claimed the courtyards, doors collapsed inward, and nature, with its quiet patience, began the slow work of forgetting. But even in this forgetting, traces remained. In some regions, ghost villages were known by locals for generations. Shepherds avoided them. Children made up stories about the spirits that lived among the ruins. Farmers ploughed carefully around the remnants of old wells and cobblestone paths. In archival records, scribes would occasionally mark "no longer inhabited" beside a village name, a sterile phrase that could not begin to capture the heartbreak behind it. For behind each vanished hamlet was a web of stories: lovers separated, elders who died alone, fields once tended with devotion. The reasons for this collapse were many and often overlapping. In some cases, the direct violence of war was to blame. A battle fought nearby might leave the settlement in ruin. In others, it was indirect. Years of taxation to fund far-off armies had drained communities of resources. When famine arrived, there was little left to offer. Still other villages succumbed to plague, spread by soldiers or refugees moving through the countryside. And in colder regions, the deepening chill of the Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons, turning fertile valleys into zones of hunger and desperation. Each force alone could be endured. Together, they became too much. There are rare windows into this vanishing. Letters from travelers speak of places where only chimneys stood, or where no dog barked at our approach. In some instances, attempts were made to resettle these ghost villages, but often they failed. The land was exhausted, the wells had gone brackish, and the memory of what had happened lingered too heavily for anyone to truly begin anew. It was not just structures that had collapsed, but trust in nature, in neighbours, in the very notion that life could be safe again. This erasure was not confined to Germany. Similar stories unfolded across Poland, Hungary, and the western edge of what is now Ukraine. In Scandinavia, scattered communities vanished as winters lengthened. In parts of France, small hamlets faded away after successive harvest failures. Even in prosperous regions like the Low Countries, marshy land that once held modest farms was surrendered back to the elements. The 1600s did not only bring destruction, they brought a retreat of the human footprint, a quiet, creeping withdrawal from the edges of settlement. Yet there is a strange kind of dignity in these forgotten places. They remind us that history is not only made in capitals or castles. It is made in fields, hearths, and the slow rhythm of village bells. The loss of a small community, its dialect, its songs, its seasons of planting and harvest, is as profound in its own way as the fall of a dynasty. These vanished villages are the dark matter of history, invisible but foundational. Without them, the world that followed could not be understood. As we move onward, deeper into the folds of the century, we carry with us the memory of these places, not as curiosities, but as quiet testaments. They ask us to consider what is lost not only in death, but in silence. And they prepare us for the larger collapses to come, ones that would shake the courts of emperors, the walls of cities, and the maps of entire continents. Far to the east, beyond the dust-choked plains of Central Asia and the forested spine of the Altai Mountains, the vast empire of Ming China stirred uneasily beneath the weight of its own century. In the early 1600s, it was still a world of splendor. Imperial palaces gleamed with lacquer and gold. Confucian scholars traced delicate brushstrokes onto silk scrolls, and canal boats drifted silently past stone bridges worn smooth by time. Yet beneath this surface of elegance and ritual, something more fragile was beginning to fracture. The Ming dynasty, once among the most formidable and enduring political structures in human history, now stood quietly at the edge of collapse. It was not a single failure that brought Ming China to its knees. Rather, it was the gradual convergence of many. A dynasty that had ruled since the 14th century was now tangled in internal corruption, natural disaster, fiscal strain, and popular unrest. A tangle too complex for any emperor to fully contain. The bureaucracy, once the envy of the world for its precision and meritocratic ideals, had grown brittle and slow. Officials were overburdened, underpaid, and frequently paralyzed by inflexible rules. Bribes, delays, and favoritism became the silent gears of governance. In the palace, the Wanli emperor, exhausted by court politics, withdrew from daily affairs, leaving the machinery of state to grind forward without clear direction. Beyond the walls of the Forbidden City, nature was delivering its own blows. The Little Ice Age touched China as well, and it did not do so gently. Northern provinces experienced colder than usual winters, reducing the yields of essential crops like millet and wheat. The summer monsoons became erratic, bringing either too much rain or none at all. The Yellow River, long known for its destructive tendencies, overflowed its banks repeatedly, submerging fields and entire villages in waves of mud and misery. At the same time, droughts in central regions crippled rice production. For a society whose rhythms had always depended on predictable seasons, the climate's sudden disobedience was both mystifying and terrifying. In the countryside, the effects were immediate and visible. Grain prices surged, famines struck with increasing frequency. Desperate peasants ate tree bark, grass, or mud. In some places, rumors of cannibalism circulated, whispered at night, never spoken aloud in daylight. Banditry grew. Farmers who could no longer support their families turned to the roads, forming small gangs and raiding storehouses, granaries, and passing merchants. These groups began not with revolution in mind, but survival. Over time, however, their actions took on a political tone. Tax collectors, seen as symbols of the state's failure, were attacked. Local officials fled. Law collapsed in entire prefectures. Meanwhile, the imperial treasury, strained by corruption, mismanagement, and declining tax revenues, found itself unable to respond. Years of military campaigns in the north, including costly conflicts against the rising Manchu tribes, had drained silver reserves. The state's reliance on imported Spanish silver from global trade routes created vulnerabilities. When shipments slowed or were diverted, inflation surged. The government began to issue paper money again, but confidence had long since eroded. Markets stuttered, salaries went unpaid, the chain of command frayed. Amid this growing instability, rebellions began to take root. The most famous would be that of Li Zicheng, a former postal worker turned insurgent leader, who rallied tens of thousands of disenfranchised peasants under his banner. Promising relief from taxes and a new moral order, his movement swept through the countryside like wind through dry grass. Fortified towns fell, local garrisons defected. The Ming military, overextended and underfunded, struggled to respond. And all the while, in the imperial court, officials debated rituals, precedents, and celestial omens, blind to the crumbling world outside their walls. Yet this is not merely a story of decline. Within the dying breath of the Ming were also moments of extraordinary endurance and grace. In the south, scholar officials redoubled their efforts to preserve classical learning, compiling vast encyclopedias and commentaries. Artists and poets captured the melancholy of the moment with exquisite subtlety, recording both the beauty and the sorrow of a vanishing world. Even amid famine and rebellion, farmers planted, mothers soothed crying children, and monks lit incense for peace. The dynasty might falter, but daily life, in its quiet resilience, went on. To understand the fall of Ming China is to recognize how fragility often hides beneath grandeur. The forbidden city still shimmered beneath golden tiles. The rituals of court continued with precise elegance. But beneath the robes and scrolls, beneath the carved dragons and lacquered halls, the empire was unraveling. Not all at once, not loudly, but like threads coming loose from a silken sleeve, one by one. And so we leave Ming China here, trembling but not yet fallen, its fate entwined with both internal decay and the gathering storm on its northern frontier. For soon, a new power would descend through the mountain passes, not only to conquer, but to remake China in its image. But before we turn to conquest, we must first witness the final breath of a great dynasty, and the hunger that opened the gates. As the spring of 1644 approached, the northern winds that brushed the rooftops of Beijing carried more than just the dust of the plains. They carried whispers, whispers of rebels to the west, whispers of court factions fracturing, whispers of something deeper still, a sense that a chapter was closing and that something vast and unknown was waiting just beyond the horizon. The capital of the Ming dynasty, once the heart of the world's most sophisticated empire, stood surrounded by ancient walls and threaded with avenues that had seen centuries of procession and power. But in those final days, its gates felt fragile, its walls uncertain. The emperor's throne still gleamed, but the ground beneath it was already beginning to shift. For years, rebellions had flared across the countryside, sparked by hunger, despair, and the absence of justice. Among them, one grew larger than the rest, a tide gathering behind a man named Li Zicheng. His beginnings were modest. Born into poverty, he worked as a servant, then a postman, then a soldier. But the collapse of order gave rise to opportunity. With charisma, discipline, and a message of radical change, he transformed his band of followers into a full-fledged insurgent force. He promised land to the tillers, silver to the poor, and justice to those who had seen none. His army marched through provinces that had grown weary of neglect, collecting allies not only through fear, but through hope. By early 1644, Li's forces had reached the gates of Beijing. The city was ill-prepared. Famine had already hollowed it from within. The military was stretched thin, demoralized, and riddled with corruption. Supplies were scarce. Outside the walls, Li's soldiers waited, not with the frantic charge of a desperate rebellion, but with the calm certainty of an approaching storm. Inside the Forbidden City, the last true Ming emperor, Chongzhen, paced through his red-pillared halls. He had been a sincere ruler, perhaps even a good one by the standards of his time. But sincerity could not undo decades of rot. He had inherited an empire unraveling from the inside. Now, that unraveling was complete. As the city teetered on the brink, the emperor made a final decision. On the night of April 25th, he gathered what remained of his court. Some fled. Others stayed and wept. Chongzhen took a sword and wandered through the palace, reportedly killing members of his own household to spare them the shame of capture. Just before dawn, he ascended a small hill behind the palace, Coal Hill, now Jingshan Park, and hanged himself from a twisted tree branch. A note pinned to his robe read simply that he had failed his people. By morning, Li Zicheng's forces had entered the city. There was no grand siege, no prolonged street fighting. The gates were opened by insiders, and the rebel army poured in. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, the Ming flag was lowered. A new regime, if only for a breath, had taken its place. But Li Zicheng's triumph would prove fragile. He declared himself ruler and tried to establish legitimacy. Yet the bureaucracy, long loyal to Ming orthodoxy, met him with reluctance. His soldiers, underfed and undisciplined, began looting, not as a coordinated policy, but as a symptom of long-deferred hunger. The people of Beijing, traumatized by years of instability, did not rush to embrace their new ruler. And worse still, the gates he had marched through were now wide open, not only to rebellion, but to something else entirely. To the north, watching with sharp eyes, stood the Manchu, a semi-nomadic people of the steppes and forests. They had grown in strength over decades, organizing under the leadership of Nurhaci and then his son, Hong Taiji. Though once considered little more than border raiders, they had built a disciplined army, a sophisticated administrative system, and a vision of conquest. As the Ming crumbled and Li Zicheng faltered, the Manchu saw their chance. They crossed the Great Wall, not with resistance, but with invitation. A Ming general, desperate to resist Li's new regime, opened the gates to the Manchu in exchange for military aid. And so the tide turned again. By the summer of 1644, just weeks after Li Zicheng had taken Beijing, the Manchu army swept in. They defeated Li's forces in battle and claimed the capital for themselves. Within a few short months, the Ming were gone, Li had fled, and a new dynasty, the Qing, had begun. It was a transition not of smooth succession, but of layered trauma. One dynasty collapsed beneath the weight of corruption and cold. Another rose from rebellion and vanished in smoke. And a third, from beyond the frontier, arrived to take its place. The fall of Beijing was not just a political shift. It marked the end of a worldview. The Confucian scholars, who had served the Ming, wrestled with loyalty and survival. Should they serve the new Qing rulers? Should they retreat into private life, preserving their moral integrity at the cost of influence? Some chose resistance, others adaptation. But all understood that a threshold had been crossed, not just of government, but of cosmic order. The mandate of heaven, once held firmly by the Ming, had passed on. And yet, amid all this, the suicide of an emperor, the looting of a capital, the rise of new rulers, daily life continued. Vendors returned to the markets. Teachers opened small schools. Families swept their courtyards in the morning light. It is perhaps the greatest quiet lesson of this century, that even when the centers of power collapse, the rhythm of life somehow finds its way forward. While much of the 17th century world staggered under the weight of famine, war, and imperial collapse, there was, for a time, one land where splendor seemed to defy the tide. In the broad river valleys and sun-drenched plains of South Asia, the Mughal Empire reached the height of its wealth, refinement, and territorial power. Great domes rose above serene gardens. Peacock thrones sparkled with gems the size of almonds. Courtiers in silk debated Persian poetry beside fountains that mirrored the sky. And beneath the marble and pageantry, the engine of one of history's most remarkable empires hummed with quiet force. The Mughal dynasty had been established in the early 1500s by Babur, a Central Asian ruler descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan. But it was in the 17th century, particularly under emperors like Jahangir and Shah Jahan, that the empire truly blossomed into a spectacle of abundance. Its territories stretched from the Hindu Kush in the northwest to the delta marshes of Bengal in the east, encompassing a population greater than that of all Europe combined. It was a realm where Hindu, Muslim, Jain, Sikh, and Buddhist communities lived, traded, and sometimes clashed, but also shared markets, customs, and languages. Diversity was not an accident, but a necessity woven into the very fabric of the Mughal state. At the empire's peak, the court of Shah Jahan glittered like few others in the early modern world. He ruled from grand fortresses in Agra and Delhi, commissioning architecture of breathtaking balance and precision. The Taj Mahal, built as a mausoleum for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, was only the most famous of these creations, a structure so perfectly proportioned that even its shadow seemed carefully placed. White marble glowed by moonlight. Inlays of lapis, jade, and coral shimmered in floral patterns. It was less a building than a memory crystallized in stone, a love letter to beauty, permanence, and sorrow. But while the imperial court dazzled foreign visitors, from Jesuit missionaries to Persian scholars, the Mughal economy rested on more practical foundations. At the heart of it all was agriculture. The empire's administrators, many trained in meticulous revenue accounting, kept detailed records of landholding, yield, and tax. Canals and irrigation projects supported rice and wheat production. Cotton fields stretched across the Deccan, while the looms of Gujarat and Bengal spun fabrics of gossamer fineness. Mughal textiles became prized across the Indian Ocean and beyond, traded for silver, spices, and ceramics. European merchants, newly active in the region, marveled at the vibrancy of Indian marketplaces, where spices, silks, and pearls passed hand to hand beneath awnings heavy with color. For ordinary people, life under Mughal rule varied widely. In some regions, local officials administered justice fairly, and religious coexistence was encouraged. In others, exploitation by landlords or military governors led to suffering and quiet rebellion. Village life continued as it always had, marked by festivals, harvests, and rituals stretching back centuries. Caste, community, and kin shaped one's daily rhythms more than the distant court. And yet, the presence of empire was always felt, in the coins that bore the emperor's name, in the languages of administration, in the architecture that rose on the skyline of even small towns. Religion played a central role in the Mughal world, but not always in the way outsiders might assume. While the emperors were Muslim, many of their subjects were not. Akbar, Shah Jahan's grandfather, had famously experimented with religious syncretism, inviting scholars of all faiths to debate in his court, and even founding a short-lived spiritual philosophy known as the Din-e-Ilahi. Later emperors would swing between tolerance and orthodoxy, depending on personality and politics. Yet beneath these shifts, the empire as a whole remained a mosaic, sometimes tense, often complex, but never wholly unified under a single creed. And even within the palace walls, contradictions abounded. Shah Jahan, so devoted to symmetry and serenity in his architecture, was also a ruler who waged costly wars. His campaigns in the Deccan strained the treasury and exposed the fragility of centralized rule in a land of such staggering diversity. Behind the walls of the harem, courtly intrigues and succession rivalries stirred restlessly. His son, Aurangzeb, would later seize power through a bloody conflict, ruling for decades with a more austere and militarized vision of empire. The seeds of future strain were already being sown, even as the Mughal world shimmered in the golden light of its prime. But for now, for this brief, luminous stretch of years, the empire held. Poetry flowed like water, music filled courtyards, caravanserais dotted trade routes from Kabul to the Bay of Bengal. In an age when so much of the world seemed to fracture, the Mughal court offered a kind of visual and cultural coherence that captured the imagination of all who beheld it. Jesuits described it with awe. Dutch merchants wrote letters full of astonishment. Persian ambassadors noted its refinement. And yet, within the beauty, time continued to press forward. The story of the Mughal Empire at its peak is not merely one of power, but of poignancy. For like all peaks, it implies a coming descent. The challenges of ruling such a vast and diverse realm would soon test even the most capable of emperors. But in the 17th century, for a moment at least, it seemed as though one part of the world had found a kind of balance. Precarious, yes, but luminous. And as we drift onward into other corners of this troubled century, that memory of balance will offer a quiet contrast to the chaos elsewhere unfolding. Across the arid plateaus and ancient caravan routes of Persia, the 17th century unfolded not with the drama of sudden collapse, but with the slow, persistent erosion of certainty. The Safavid Empire, which had once risen with such confidence at the start of the 1500s, entered this century with power still in hand and cities still alive with trade and ritual. From the glittering tiled mosques of Isfahan to the snow-dusted peaks of the Zagros Mountains, the realm remained one of poetry, craftsmanship, and sheer piety. But like so many others in this strange and turbulent century, it too began to strain beneath the weight of natural shifts and human limits. The reign of Shah Abbas I, who died in 1629, marked the zenith of Safavid rule. His capital at Isfahan was called Nesf-e-Jahan, half the world, by its admirers, and for good reason. Elegant bridges spanned the Zayandeh River. Blue domes glittered beneath desert sun. The royal square, the Maidan, throbbed with energy. Scholars debated, artisans displayed their wares, and merchants from Venice to Samarkand haggled over silk and spices. Abbas had strengthened the empire's military, curbed the power of unruly tribal nobles, and encouraged trade routes that connected Persia to the wider world. In many ways, it was a moment of consolidation, the dream of empire briefly made real. But what followed, as the decades passed, was a slow drift downward. The successors of Shah Abbas lacked his energy, his ruthlessness, and his vision. Court intrigue grew thicker, while administrative clarity thinned. The Safavid bureaucracy, heavily reliant on court eunuchs and the Persianate elite, began to buckle under the pressures of inflation and mismanagement. The empire's wealth, once buoyed by active trade and steady harvests, grew less predictable. And behind the palace walls, a sense of inwardness began to take hold, a turning away from the vigorous experimentation of Abbas's day towards something more cautious, more brittle. Outside the court, the land itself had begun to change. The Little Ice Age, that subtle but relentless climatic shift, made its presence felt even in Persia's diverse landscapes. In the highlands, snowpack lingered longer than expected. In the arid zones, rainfall patterns grew erratic. These shifts did not bring a single crushing famine, but rather a series of small, cumulative hardships. Crops failed sporadically. Pasture land dried. Local food shortages became more common. In the towns and villages of the interior, prices rose unevenly, and people began to move in quiet, desperate waves toward wherever grain still flowed. As hunger spread, so too did faith. Persia was, by this time, firmly established as a Shia stronghold, a transformation that had been aggressively pursued by earlier Safavid rulers. Religious festivals and mourning rituals, especially those honoring the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, became central to public life. In the face of hardship, these ceremonies offered not only comfort, but identity. Streets filled with processions, self-flagellation, and chanted sorrow. The lines between theology and governance blurred. The ulama, or religious scholars, held growing sway over daily life, and their sermons increasingly shaped how people understood their suffering. Drought was a test, famine a reminder. Hardship was folded into a spiritual narrative of endurance and cosmic struggle. But even as faith deepened, so too did discontent. Tribal confederations on the empire's periphery grew more restless, sensing weakness at the center. In the northeast, Uzbek incursions tested Persian defenses. Along the Persian Gulf, European trading companies, Dutch, Portuguese, and later English, began to shift their loyalties depending on profit, further complicating the Safavids' grasp on vital maritime routes. Inland, the empire's traditional reliance on silk exports faltered amid global fluctuations and local instability. And all the while, in the quiet corners of the realm, people endured the slow tightening of the world around them. There is a particular stillness to Persian history in this century, not a lack of movement, but a heaviness. The great thinkers and poets of the age did not vanish, but their tone changed. Melancholy crept into the literature. Nostalgia colored the prose. Architecture continued, but now with hints of repetition and constraint. The grandeur of the past was remembered, even revered, but rarely matched. Travelers who visited Persia in the later 1600s still found beauty, but they also noted an undercurrent of stagnation, a realm that had become inward-looking, guarded, and increasingly reliant on its spiritual rather than political authority. And yet, through it all, the everyday life of the Persian people went on. Carpets were still woven with quiet precision. Saffron and almonds still flavored the stews of humble homes. Children still learned to recite the verses of Hafez in the Quran, sometimes with equal reverence. In the bazaars of Yazd and Shiraz, vendors still laid out dried fruit, painted ceramics and rosewater in clay jars. Faith and famine existed side by side, not as opposites, but as parts of the same rhythm, the same long century of adjustment. As we drift away from Safavid Persia, we leave behind a world caught between glories past and pressures mounting, an empire that had once flourished along the Silk Road, now turning inward beneath the weight of slow hunger and rising piety. In its stillness, there is a mirror to be held up to the century itself. Not all disasters roar. Some unfold softly, like a well closing drop by drop, until the thirst is undeniable. Across the lands that curved from the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia, the Ottoman Empire once ruled with a poise and confidence that few could rival. For centuries, it had been the empire of sultans and viziers, of grand mosques rising over ancient cities, of caravans threading the spine of Anatolia, and ships patrolling the eastern Mediterranean with practiced ease. But in the 17th century, even this mighty domain, so often imagined as a fortress of tradition and order, began to feel the slow pressure of fatigue. Though its borders remained vast and its palaces still shimmered with ceremony, the Ottoman world was entering a century not of collapse, but of quiet, grinding strain. The early decades opened under the reign of Sultan Ahmed I, remembered for commissioning the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, a structure of soaring domes and cascading courtyards, designed to stand opposite the ancient Hagia Sophia as both echo and rival. But even as its marble columns rose skyward, trouble was gathering at the empire's edges. To the east, the Safavids pressed against the Ottoman frontier. To the north, unrest simmered in the Hungarian plains and beyond. And within, more subtly, the foundations of Ottoman stability began to tremble beneath the combined weight of inflation, military unrest, and a changing world economy. One of the most disruptive forces was the price revolution, a continent-wide inflation partly driven by the influx of New World silver into global markets. As prices rose, the salaries of state officials and soldiers failed to keep pace. The Janissaries, once the elite core of the Ottoman military and a pillar of centralized control, began to grow restless. These soldiers, originally composed of Christian boys taken from their families through the Devshirme system and trained in strict discipline, had become, over time, a politicized, sometimes unruly force. In this new century, many Janissaries married, entered trade, and began to see their military service as hereditary. Their loyalty wavered, their discipline frayed. In times of crisis, they no longer marched as one. And sometimes, they turned on the palace itself. At the same time, local power holders known as Ayan rose in prominence. These provincial notables collected taxes, maintained order, and often acted as the Sultan's representatives in rural areas. But as the central authority struggled to maintain control, the Ayan gained independence, carving out semi-autonomous pockets of power that complicated the empire's once efficient bureaucracy. In Anatolia and the Arab provinces, these shifts led to regional instability. Uprisings flared, banditry increased, travel between cities became more dangerous, and the flow of goods more uncertain. Layered atop these internal pressures was the same climate strain felt across the globe. The Little Ice Age touched Ottoman lands with uneven hands, bringing drought to Syria one year, flash floods to Bosnia the next. harvests faltered. The once stable Timar system, through which land was granted to soldiers in exchange for military service, began to weaken as revenues from agriculture grew less reliable. Villagers abandoned unproductive plots. Some drifted into cities, swelling the slums. Others joined bandit groups or sought protection under local warlords. The social fabric, once held together by a balance of religious community, local administration, and imperial promise, began to thin. And yet, through all of this, the empire endured. Its cities still bustled with life. Istanbul, straddling the Bosphorus, remained a metropolis of profound beauty and contradiction. Its skyline marked by minarets and smoke, its streets alive with the calls of vendors, the rustle of silks, the scent of spices and roasting meat. The Ottomans remained master builders and able diplomats. Their court rituals continued with solemn grandeur. Treaties were signed, battles won. But beneath the surface, the mechanisms of governance grew creaky, slower to respond, more vulnerable to corruption and paralysis. One emblem of the changing times was the growing influence of the palace harem, not in the salacious sense often imagined by Western observers, but as a true center of power. Women of the imperial family, particularly the queen mothers or Valid sultans, played an increasing role in state affairs. Behind the veil of court etiquette, decisions were shaped by maternal whispers and alliances built in the shadows. Some historians have called this the era of the Sultanate of Women, a time when female advisors, consorts, and mothers held the reins of empire in ways subtle but significant. It was not a collapse of authority, but a reorientation, forced by circumstance and enabled by the complexities of palace life. In the provinces, religious leaders known as ulama continued to mediate justice, uphold moral standards, and preserve continuity. Mosques remained centers of education and spiritual life. Sufi brotherhoods offered solace and structure amid uncertainty, their lodges sheltering travelers and the poor alike. In villages, life adapted as best it could. Olive groves still bore fruit. Shepherds still guided flocks through rocky hills. The empire may have strained, but its people, shaped by centuries of imperial rhythm, found ways to carry on. The 17th century for the Ottoman Empire was not one of spectacular collapse, but of accumulated tension. A gradual build-up of unresolved pressures that would echo into the centuries to come. It is easy, in retrospect, to view it as decline, but to those who lived within it, it was something subtler, an age of adjustment, of improvisation, of holding on. And so we leave the empire of domes and deserts, of crossroads and contradictions, still standing, for now. Ahead lie more upheavals, but for a moment longer, the Ottomans remain upright beneath the weight of a shifting world. Their story reminds us that not all fractures split with noise. Some stretch slowly, invisibly across the surface, until one day they reshape the ground beneath our feet. Amid the frosted hills and flickering hearths of early modern Europe, there settled a quiet fear, one that whispered through meadows, crept along forest edges, and lingered in the corners of candlelit homes. It was not the fear of armies or emperors, but something older, closer, and more intimate. In the 17th century, across wide stretches of Europe, thousands of people, most of them women, were accused of consorting with the devil. Their neighbors testified, their churches condemned, and in many cases, the accusations led not to repentance, but to fire. This was the age of the great European witch hunts, and though it now seems distant and implausible, it was very real to those who lived and died within its shadow. The roots of these persecutions lay deep within the continent's evolving cultural soil. For centuries, Christianity had battled what it saw as heresy, but it wasn't until the late 15th century that the idea of witchcraft as an organized demonic conspiracy began to take hold. The invention of the printing press spread lurid tracts, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, which offered detailed guidance on identifying, interrogating, and condemning witches. By the 17th century, this paranoid vision had begun to ripple outward, finding fertile ground in communities already strained by war, famine, and climate disruption. In an age of unpredictability, the desire for control and for scapegoats quietly intensified. Witch hunts did not emerge everywhere at once, nor did they follow a single pattern. Some were concentrated in the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in its German-speaking regions, where fragmented legal systems allowed local judges great autonomy. Others took root in Scotland, Switzerland, France, and parts of Eastern Europe. While England and the Netherlands experienced fewer executions, the panic still touched their shores. In many cases, the accusations were highly localized, the outcome of long-simmering grievances, village rivalries, or unexplained illness. A failed harvest, a sick child, a dead cow. Any misfortune could become a spark, and suspicion often settled on those who lived on society's margins. Most of the accused were women, particularly older women, widows, or those who lived alone. They were seen as vulnerable, peculiar, or simply inconvenient. Sometimes they were midwives or healers whose knowledge of herbs set them apart. Other times they were simply the unlucky recipients of rumor. Once accused, the road to execution was perilously short. Under torture or threat, confessions were often extracted. People named others. Chains of accusation lengthened. Communities, caught in the cycle, saw themselves as purging a hidden evil, even as fear hollowed the bonds between neighbors. The psychological toll was immense. In towns like Würzburg and Bamberg, hundreds were executed in sweeping panics. Children were forced to testify against parents. Confessions spiraled into impossible detail. Stories of midnight Sabbaths flying through the air and grotesque pacts made in the dark. These were not tales told by the mad, but by frightened people pushed to the edge of imagination by pain, coercion, and cultural expectation. The line between reality and belief blurred, and behind it all lurked a deeper unease. The sense that the world no longer made sense, and that only through purgation could balance be restored. But even in this bleakness, patterns of resistance quietly emerged. Some judges grew skeptical. Some theologians questioned the logic of mass accusations. In regions where legal safeguards were stronger, the panics were contained. In the Dutch Republic and parts of Italy, where inquisitorial procedures required firmer evidence, executions were rare. And eventually, even in the heartlands of persecution, the flames began to cool. By the late 1600s, scientific thinking, legal reform, and shifting religious attitudes brought a slow, hesitant end to the worst of the witch trials. But not before tens of thousands had been accused, and many thousands killed. The legacy of the witch hunts is not only one of injustice, but of vulnerability. It reveals how fear, when combined with power, pressure, and isolation, can curdle into cruelty. And it reminds us that the deadliest ideas often arrive not with swords, but with whispers. In the quiet of village life, it does not take much to transform suspicion into certainty. Yet the 17th century also held those who saw through the madness, judges who refused to prosecute, priests who preached compassion, communities that sheltered the accused. Their names are often lost to history, but their presence mattered. For just as fear can spread, so too can reason. Slowly, like thawing snow in spring. As we drift onward, we leave behind the cold fields of accusation and turn toward another plague of the century. One that knew no trials, no judges, and no mercy. For even as the witch hunts receded, the great shadow of pestilence continued to fall across the land. The next chapter in this quiet history leads us into the silence of closed doors and boarded windows, where plague returned again and again, never quite gone, never quite defeated. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a city struck by plague. It is not the silence of peace, nor even of mourning, but something deeper. A hush made of absence. Footsteps grow rare. Market stalls stand empty. The bells toll more often and for fewer to hear them. In the 17th century, this stillness returned again and again as plague moved across continents in slow, terrible rhythms. It arrived like a shadow in the afternoon, at first unnoticed, then undeniable. And when it passed, it left behind not only the dead, but the feeling that the world had briefly stopped breathing. Though the great pandemic of the 14th century is most often remembered, the 1600s were no less marked by waves of pestilence. Across the Ottoman world, the Habsburg lands, France, Russia, and beyond, plague persisted as a recurring guest, unwelcome, familiar, and stubborn. It moved through trade routes and port cities, carried by fleas clinging to rats, or perhaps by unseen human carriers. In an age before germ theory, no one could explain its movement with certainty. People feared bad air, astrological signs, and divine punishment. They burned incense, avoided foreigners, and lit candles to saints. But the disease returned all the same, indifferent to prayers and borders. In Constantinople, plague was a seasonal visitor, arriving most often in the warmer months. The city, still a hub of trade and empire, found itself vulnerable to infections brought by ships from Alexandria, Venice, and beyond. Entire neighborhoods would empty, corpses piled in alleyways. The city's chroniclers recorded outbreaks not with surprise, but with weary resignation. Over the course of the century, dozens of waves swept through. One especially devastating outbreak in the 1660s was said to claim nearly a third of the city's population. Yet life resumed between the waves, as it always did. Markets reopened, weddings were held, children played once more in streets that had briefly become pathways of sorrow. To the west, plague struck with equal cruelty. In 1629, northern Italy was gripped by what would become known as the Great Plague of Milan. The infection spread from soldiers and refugees moving through the countryside, men fleeing the conflicts of the 30 Years' War, bringing with them more than just stories. Within a year, cities like Bergamo, Verona, and Milan were overwhelmed. The mortality rate soared. Doctors, when they dared to visit the sick, wore long-beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs. The image remains iconic, surreal, almost theatrical, but in truth, it was a symbol of helplessness disguised as ritual. France, too, suffered. Between 1628 and 1631, the south of the country endured a particularly severe outbreak. Towns in Provence and Languedoc saw populations halved. In the bustling port of Marseille, fear paralyzed commerce. Entire districts were barricaded. Families left their dead inside homes, afraid to touch or even mourn them. Elsewhere in Europe, similar stories unfolded. Sudden outbreaks in Vienna, waves of death in Krakow, smaller occurrences in London and Amsterdam. No region remained untouched forever. The plague did not obey patterns. It arrived when it pleased and lingered as long as the conditions allowed. And when the infection passed, it left behind more than graves. It reshaped behavior. People avoided touch. Letters were fumigated before being opened. Cities established health boards, quarantine stations, and cordon zones, early attempts at public health, born not from theory, but desperation. Travelers were held in isolation before entering towns. Ships were required to wait in anchor bays for weeks before docking. The very word quarantine, derived from the Italian quaranta for 40 days, became a fixture of life. In smaller towns, the impact was even more intimate. A local outbreak could leave entire lineages extinguished. Churches lost choirs, bakers lost apprentices, and elders were buried with the memories of stories they would no longer tell. The landscape itself became a kind of ledger of absence. Overgrown cemeteries, unused wells, and farms fallen to weed. And yet, even here, people endured. survivors planted new crops. Orphans were taken in. Life shrank for a time, but it did not vanish. There were those who sought explanation beyond the divine. As the century wore on, a handful of thinkers, often physicians or natural philosophers, began to speculate that plague might be contagious, transmitted through contact or proximity. They had no microscopes, no laboratory proof, but their observations hinted at patterns, and their cautious proposals began to shape urban policy. These ideas, tentative and uncertain, marked the slow beginning of a new understanding. The scientific revolution, still in its early tremors, was beginning to open a door through which future generations would walk with clearer eyes. Still, for most in the 1600s, plague remained a mystery. It was feared, respected, and woven into the seasonal rhythms of life. Some years it came, some years it did not, and when it did, the living adapted. They learned to read its signs, the silence of birds, the tension in the air, the sudden absence of neighbors. They learned to wait, to mourn, and eventually to resume. As we leave the shuttered homes and black-cloaked doctors of this chapter behind, we do so with the knowledge that plague was not the only shadow falling across the century. In other corners of the world, different forces were reshaping life, slow changes in land, climate, and commerce that would bind faraway regions more tightly together. The next chapter leads us into Africa's interior, where environmental strain and expanding networks of trade quietly transformed societies that had long balanced with their lands. Far from the court intrigues of Europe and the palaces of Asia, the interior of Africa moved to its own deep and rhythmic pulse. In the 17th century, the continent was no stranger to empire, trade, or transformation. Its kingdoms had risen and fallen for centuries, shaped by the sweep of savanna winds, the flow of desert caravans, and the quiet authority of ancestral spirits. But this century, like so many others, brought with it subtle shifts that would ripple outward, touching everything from local rituals to global commerce. Across the forests, grasslands, and river basins of Africa's interior, life adjusted to changes both visible and unseen. The 1600s in Africa were not defined by a single catastrophe, but by a series of overlapping currents, environmental, economic, and political, that slowly reconfigured the balance of power. In the Western Sahel and the savannas beyond, climatic changes tied to the Little Ice Age brought erratic rainfall, shorter growing seasons, and shifting patterns of animal migration. For pastoralists, whose herds depended on predictable cycles of water and grass, this created mounting pressure. For farmers, drought meant failed harvests and occasional famine. While these changes were uneven and localized, their effects were deeply felt. Communities adjusted planting schedules, moved settlements, or adopted new crops, but the strain was real and persistent. In response, many societies turned inward, reinforcing older traditions, tightening kin networks, and invoking spiritual protections against forces that felt increasingly unstable. Shrines were visited more often. Diviners were consulted about the behavior of the rains. Elders, long seen as the keepers of balance, gained renewed authority. And yet, alongside this spiritual centering, new external pressures were quietly building at the edges of the continent. European contact with coastal Africa was not new in the 1600s. Portuguese explorers and traders had been present since the late 15th century, building forts and exchanging goods along the Atlantic shores. But by the 17th century, the pace and scale of interaction began to change. Dutch, English, and French ships arrived with increasing frequency, seeking gold, ivory, and human lives. Along the coastlines of what are now Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, and Senegal, European forts multiplied, trade expanded, and the economies of some African kingdoms began to tilt toward this new Atlantic market. Inland, this meant that power began to shift toward polities that could supply these new demands. Kingdoms like Dahomey, the Oyo Empire, and the Asante Confederacy gained prominence, often through control of trade routes, horses, or access to captives. Raiding increased, not only as a tool of war, but as a means of wealth accumulation. The demand for enslaved people, fueled by European plantations across the Atlantic, reshaped the very structure of conflict. Wars that might once have ended with tribute or territory now ended with the forced movement of thousands. Entire communities vanished into distant ships, their names lost to both oral history and written record. Yet to imagine the 17th century African interior as merely a place of capture or collapse is to miss its fullness. It was still, overwhelmingly, a land of life. Market towns bustled with trade in kola nuts, cloth, salt, and iron. Healers treated illness with herbs and incantations passed down through generations. Storytellers gathered children around fires to share epics of origin and migration. Kings consulted rainmakers. Blacksmiths hammered rhythms into their craft, shaping blades and farming tools from glowing metal. In forests, elephants moved with ancient calm, and in the delta of the Niger, fishing canoes slipped silently through winding channels. And throughout these lands, identity remained deeply local. Clan, lineage, and place shaped daily life far more than abstract borders or distant capitals. People lived in rhythms of reciprocity and tradition, rooted in land and memory. Even where kingdoms grew ambitious, their power often flowed outward through persuasion and alliance rather than absolute command. Governance was as much a matter of counsel as decree. Justice was woven into song, proverb, and ceremony. And though the world around was changing, though guns now arrived where once only iron had, the essential dignity of these ways of life remained. Still, change was creeping inward. The arrival of firearms, traded for captives or goods, began to tip balances of power. Kingdoms that acquired guns through trade gained a sudden advantage over neighbors, fueling new cycles of warfare and expansion. The impact was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. The geography of power began to harden. Old rivals fell. New leaders rose, often younger, more militarized, and less bound by the elders' counsels of old. The traditional rhythms of diplomacy and warfare were altered by the promise of profit and the growing presence of European intermediaries. In the great arc of African history, the 17th century sits not as a rupture, but as a hinge. It is the slow turning of a door that would open onto even greater upheaval in centuries to come. But in its own time, it was still a century of balance, uneasy, shifting, but not yet broken. A time when communities remembered old songs while learning to speak the language of new markets. When hardship arrived in the form of dry winds, but hope remained rooted in the sacred earth. As we move forward, we follow the current of commerce as it leaves Africa's western shores and stretches across the Atlantic, where demand for labor would soon link the fates of faraway continents. The next chapter leads us into the rising tide of the transatlantic slave trade, not as a single event, but as a quiet, growing engine of history that would remake the world's rhythms for centuries to come. At the edge of the Atlantic, where waves once met sand in quiet solitude, the winds began to shift. What had been a scattered trade of spices, gold, and ivory now transformed into something darker and more enduring. During the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade expanded not as an overnight catastrophe, but as a slow, calculated system, built ship by ship, port by port, agreement by agreement. It became a machine that consumed lives and reshaped continents, binding Africa, Europe, and the Americas into a new kind of economy, one in which human beings were bought, sold, and shipped across oceans as commodities. By the early 1600s, European interest in African labor had grown from curiosity to obsession. Sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean demanded a workforce capable of withstanding heat, disease, and grueling toil. Indigenous populations, devastated by conquest and disease, could no longer meet colonial demands. European indentured labor was insufficient. The answer, in the minds of colonial planners, was to intensify the trade in African captives, a system that had existed in smaller forms for centuries, but now expanded into something vast and systematic. The Portuguese, who had long navigated West African coasts, were joined by Dutch, English, and French traders. Forts and warehouses appeared along shorelines like Teeth, Elmina, Cape Coast, Ouidah, Luanda. From these outposts, goods were exchanged: firearms, cloth, liquor, and metal wares, for people taken from inland raids, wars, or as tribute. African intermediaries, often powerful rulers or merchants, negotiated these transactions, sometimes incorporating them into older systems of warfare or justice, other times reshaping their entire economies to meet European demand. These were not passive victims, nor simple villains, but agents navigating impossible choices under growing pressure. The journey across the Atlantic, later called the Middle Passage, was a horror known to generations of those who endured it. Packed tightly into dark holds, shackled in pairs, and provided minimal food or water, enslaved people endured weeks, sometimes months, at sea. Disease spread easily. Despair ran deep. Death came often. Many resisted. Some jumped into the sea rather than live on in bondage. Others sang to preserve memory, murmured prayers to distant gods, or carved quiet resistance into the boards beneath them. Each voyage was its own moving tragedy, lost to the waves but echoed in centuries of silence. Upon arrival in the Americas, survivors were sold at auction, stripped not only of freedom, but of name, language, and lineage. They were dispersed across vast plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, forced to work under watchful eyes and in brutal conditions. Sugar was the primary crop, a labor-intensive harvest that demanded constant attention and which fed the appetites of Europe's growing sweet tooth. But tobacco, cotton, indigo, and rice also relied on enslaved labor, making slavery not a sideline of empire, but its economic core. Yet even amid such cruelty, enslaved people created lives that resisted erasure. In music, in ritual, in story and belief, they preserved pieces of home. They adapted old practices to new soil, crafting spiritual and cultural worlds that endured despite the violence. Families, though often torn apart, found ways to remake themselves. Marriages were spoken in whispers, lullabies passed down in the dark. Revolts and escapes occurred more often than many records admit. And in fields and kitchens, enslaved people reshaped the very societies that sought to erase them, influencing cuisine, language, religion, and culture in ways that continue to echo today. Back in Europe, the profits from slavery threaded themselves into cities, banks, and institutions. Sugar sweetened the tea of London's elite. Cotton clothed the streets of Paris. Port cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Amsterdam grew wealthy, not despite slavery, but because of it. The moral cost of the trade was discussed, but rarely reckoned with. Church leaders preached against sin while blessing ships. Philosophers debated liberty while investing in human cargo. It would take generations before the contradictions began to crack. And still, even in the 1600s, there were voices who questioned. Some African rulers resisted the trade or limited their participation. Some European sailors recoiled at what they saw. In Africa, families mourned those who vanished. In the Americas, enslaved people sang laments and resistance songs, invoking gods and ancestors to guide them through suffering. These voices, though often buried beneath ledgers and treaties, still flicker through the silence of history, reminders that humanity persisted even in the darkest corners. The rise of the Atlantic slave trade was not a moment, but a process, one that accelerated throughout the 17th century, fed by the demands of empire and the illusions of economic necessity. It reshaped demography, economy, and culture on 3 continents, often in ways that were invisible to those living through them. The forest clearing that became a port, the ritual song that now had to be whispered, the child born into bondage who still knew how to smile. As we move onward, we leave the shorelines behind and look to the far side of the ocean, to the lands where these people were taken, and to the resistance that quietly stirred beneath the weight of empire. In the Americas, conquest was never total. Indigenous peoples, though ravaged by disease and war, continued to resist, adapt, and endure. Their stories, so often told as endings, are in truth stories of survival. The next chapter gently guides us into their world. Beneath the canopy of vast forests, along mountain ridges traced by wind, and across desert plains where starlight clung to the rocks, the indigenous peoples of the Americas continued to live and resist. Though the arrival of European empires in the 15th and 16th centuries had brought waves of death and disruption, conquest had never been complete. In the 17th century, amid the growing chaos of global conflict and colonial ambition, many native societies across North, Central, and South America found ways not only to endure, but to push back, to adapt, and to remember who they were. In history books, this century is often framed as a time when native power receded, replaced by European settlement and administration. But the deeper story is one of complexity and persistence. Across the Americas, indigenous nations did not simply vanish in the face of colonial expansion. They negotiated, resisted, and redefined the terms of engagement, sometimes with arms, sometimes with diplomacy, and often through the quiet, stubborn continuity of daily life. They carried forward languages, stories, and sacred knowledge, even as borders shifted and new religions arrived. In the Andes, the Inca Empire had fallen to the Spanish a century earlier, yet highland communities continued to maintain ancestral practices beneath the surface of colonial rule. Quipu, the intricate system of knotted cords once used for record-keeping, still hung in hidden places. Quechua prayers mingled with Catholic rites, creating a syncretic faith that comforted while subtly defying imposed authority. Periodic revolts broke out, not with dreams of full restoration, but with the hope of dignity and recognition. Spanish administrators often found themselves unable to fully control the rugged terrain or the spiritual allegiances of its people. Further north, in the dense woodlands of what is now the eastern United States and Canada, the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Haudenosaunee, rose in prominence. Comprised of 5 and later 6 nations, they created a sophisticated political alliance that balanced unity with independence. The Great Law of Peace, a set of principles rooted in consensus and kinship, guided decision-making and helped maintain cohesion even in times of external pressure. During the 17th century, the Haudenosaunee engaged in the so-called Beaver Wars, a series of conflicts and strategic maneuvers aimed at controlling trade routes and expanding influence. Far from being passive recipients of colonial power, they acted as regional players, forging, breaking, and manipulating alliances with Dutch, French, and English colonists as they saw fit. In the southeast, the Mississippian legacy still lingered, though the mound-building civilizations had long since faded. The Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw peoples adapted to shifting trade dynamics and expanding colonial frontiers. They adopted horses, firearms, and new agricultural techniques, reshaping their societies without relinquishing their sovereignty. Some indigenous nations built trade networks that reached across hundreds of miles, exchanging goods, marriages, and diplomacy with remarkable sophistication. Even in regions where population loss from disease had been staggering, resilience endured. In Mesoamerica, Nahua communities still practiced rituals tied to cycles of the sun and maize, even as Spanish priests tried to suppress them. Calendars survived in hidden notebooks. Codices were copied in secret. Festivals continued in slightly altered forms. The outer appearance might have changed, saints instead of gods, chapels instead of pyramids. But the inner meanings persisted, layered and enduring. In the arid southwest, the Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi and Zuni, lived in adobe villages that had stood for generations. Their ceremonies followed ancient rhythms, tuned to the harvest, the moon, and the wind. In 1680, after decades of repression by Spanish missionaries, the Pueblo Revolt erupted. A rare but remarkable moment when indigenous peoples across multiple communities coordinated to drive out colonial occupiers. Though Spanish rule eventually returned, the revolt remained a testament to collective memory and resistance. A declaration that even centuries after conquest, indigenous agency remained very much alive. Across the Great Plains, horses introduced by the Spanish spread northward, revolutionizing mobility, hunting, and warfare. The Comanche, Lakota, and Blackfoot adapted quickly, building cultures that would thrive in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the seeds were planted in this earlier period, as small bands learned to master the land in new ways, always attuned to its subtle patterns and sacred echoes. In all these places, indigenous resistance was not only political or military, it was cultural. It was embedded in lullabies sung to infants, in corn planted with ceremonial care, in languages spoken around hearths when outsiders had left. It was the refusal to forget, even when remembering brought pain. It was the quiet brilliance of adaptation, the kind that allowed communities to survive against odds that outsiders believed insurmountable. European colonists often misunderstood what they saw. They mistook accommodation for weakness, hybridity for loss. But in truth, indigenous societies were navigating an entirely new world. Not by abandoning who they were, but by recalibrating how to remain so. They absorbed what could be used, rejected what could not, and found ways to exist in overlapping worlds. One imposed, one inherited. As we move from these stories of resistance and endurance, we turn now to a land that took a very different path. In 17th century Japan, the ruling Tokugawa shogunate looked inward, closing itself to most foreign contact and cultivating a unique form of peace and order. While the world around it bent beneath the weight of trade and war, Japan entered a long stillness. In the next chapter, we'll step gently into that stillness, to a place where time slowed and isolation became a form of quiet strength. While the rest of the world surged with movement, armies marching, ships departing, empires rising and receding, Japan chose a different course. In the early decades of the 17th century, as silver flowed across oceans and plague wandered from port to port, the Japanese archipelago settled into a long, deliberate quiet. Under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan did not crumble, nor did it expand. Instead, it folded in on itself like a silk fan, not in retreat, but in careful preservation. And in doing so, it crafted one of the most unusual stories of the century, a time of peace and order, born not from conquest, but from containment. This chapter began in 1603, when Tokugawa Ieyasu, a seasoned warlord and political strategist, was named shogun, military ruler, after decades of civil war and clan rivalry. The title gave him power not just in name, but in function. While the emperor remained a spiritual and symbolic figure in Kyoto, the real authority now rested with the Tokugawa family, who established their government in Edo, the city that would later become Tokyo. The goal of the new shogunate was not glory or expansion, but control. And it was achieved with remarkable precision. One of the first and most enduring policies implemented was known as sakoku, literally, closed country. From the 1630s onward, Japan began to sever most of its connections with the outside world. Foreign trade was sharply restricted. Portuguese missionaries were expelled, Christianity was outlawed, and Japanese converts were persecuted. The fear was not merely religious, it was political. Foreign ideas, loyalties, and technologies were seen as threats to the fragile order that the Tokugawa had so carefully established. By controlling outside influence, the shogunate hoped to ensure internal stability. This policy was not absolute isolation. Trade continued, but only through carefully controlled channels. Dutch and Chinese merchants were allowed to operate in Nagasaki, confined to small islands or compounds under close supervision. The Dutch, stripped of their missionaries, were tolerated for their practical knowledge and goods. In return, they brought news of the outside world, medical texts, scientific instruments, and occasional maps. But for the vast majority of the population, the world beyond the islands became distant, a murmur heard only through controlled whispers. Domestically, the Tokugawa system emphasized hierarchy and harmony. Society was stratified into four main classes: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, each with defined roles and expectations. Movement between classes was rare. Samurai, once warriors, became bureaucrats and administrators. Farmers, considered the moral backbone of society, were heavily taxed but respected. Artisans provided the tools and goods that sustained daily life, while merchants, despite their growing wealth, were often viewed with suspicion for their focus on profit. Travel within Japan was restricted. Lords, or daimyo, were required to spend alternating years in Edo under the Sankin Kotai system, a form of political hostage-taking that kept them loyal and financially dependent on the central government. Roads were improved, but checkpoints monitored movement. The effect was a tightly woven web of order, one that prevented rebellion, discouraged ambition, and preserved peace. For over 2 centuries, Japan would remain largely untouched by the wars and conquests that racked the world beyond its shores. But peace did not mean stagnation. Within the stillness of Sakoku, a rich cultural life quietly flourished. Towns grew, theatre blossomed, particularly the dramatic, stylized performances of kabuki. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, captured scenes of urban life, landscapes, and courtesans with remarkable elegance. Poetry, especially in the form of haiku, distilled fleeting moments into crystalline verse. Even science, known as rangaku or Dutch learning, took root in scholarly circles as Japanese doctors and thinkers absorbed foreign ideas within the boundaries allowed. The people of Japan adjusted to this steady rhythm. Farmers measured time by the pulse of rice, planting and harvest. Artisans passed their trades from parent to child, refining techniques over generations. Samurai carried swords not to battle, but as symbols of a bygone role, now redefined by paperwork and ritual. The Edo period, as it came to be known, was one of slow refinement, a deepening rather than a widening. The emphasis was not on conquering new lands, but on maintaining balance within one's own. This balance came at a cost. Dissent was silenced. Class boundaries hardened. Famines occasionally broke the surface calm, and peasant uprisings, though usually brief and local, served as reminders that beneath any stillness, tension remains. And for many, especially women and lower-class citizens, the constraints of order could be suffocating. But compared to the rest of the world, where war, disease, and collapse reshaped daily life, Japan in the 1600s offered a rare kind of continuity, one that prized survival through steadiness and peace through discipline. As we leave the walled gardens and ink-washed scrolls of Edo, Japan, we carry with us a vision of a world where silence was not a void, but a design, where history moved slowly, purposefully, and often invisibly. And ahead, as we drift back into the wider web of the 17th century, we return to the places where ideas and discoveries were beginning to stir, where, even in chaos, human curiosity began to shine. The next chapter carries us gently into this dawning light, to the quiet beginnings of science as we now know it, and to the thinkers who, amid plague and instability, looked up at the stars and down into the fabric of matter, asking questions that would outlive the century itself. Beneath skies darkened by plague and wars that seemed never to end, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not on battlefields or in palaces, but in gardens, workshops, and candlelit studies. In the midst of the 17th century's disorder, certain minds began to look past the shifting struggles of kings and into the steady patterns of nature. They asked not what the gods decreed, but how the world worked. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of modern science, gently, carefully, often without realizing how deeply those roots would grow. This was not yet the age of laboratories and white coats. The tools were simple: telescopes ground by hand, pendulums swinging in empty halls, prisms held up to passing light. The questions were older than the century. What moves the planets? Why do objects fall? How does the heart beat? But the answers were beginning to shift. Where earlier generations had looked to Aristotle or scripture, these thinkers now sought knowledge through observation, mathematics, and quiet experimentation. Slowly, a new kind of certainty began to take shape, not absolute, but testable, repeatable, and shared. In Italy, Galileo Galilei had already begun to challenge the heavens. With a telescope barely the length of his arm, he observed moons orbiting Jupiter and sunspots sliding across the solar surface. His discoveries contradicted centuries of accepted belief, showing that the heavens were not perfect and unchanging. For these ideas, he faced trial and silence. But his vision of a universe governed by laws, not whim, endured. Even under house arrest, he wrote, thought, and refined. His whisper would become an echo that rang far beyond his time. Further north, in England, a quiet, solitary scholar named Isaac Newton began to unravel the mysteries of motion and light. Born in 1642, the year Galileo died, Newton's early life was marked by plague. His university closed during an outbreak, forcing him to return home. But in that solitude, he saw further. In the orchard of his family's estate, legend would place an apple's fall at the heart of his thinking, though the truth was more complex. By the end of the century, Newton's laws of motion and theory of universal gravitation would describe the cosmos with breathtaking clarity. His Principia Mathematica, dense and meticulous, became a cornerstone of modern physics. He was not a man of the world, but he redefined the way the world was understood. Elsewhere, others turned their attention to the small and unseen. In the Netherlands, Antony van Leeuwenhoek crafted microscopes so fine they could magnify the ordinary into the extraordinary. Through tiny lenses, he saw animalcules, living things invisible to the naked eye, swimming in droplets of water. It was a discovery that collapsed assumptions and opened a hidden world. The body, the leaf, the mold on bread, all became landscapes of intricate motion. And with each new glance, the boundaries of the known shifted. Across the continent, ideas passed slowly from hand to hand. Letters crossed borders even during wars, written in cautious Latin or precise French. Scientific societies began to form, informal at first, then more structured. The Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, created a space for shared curiosity, where experiment and observation were prized above authority or tradition. Nullius in verba, their motto read, "Take nobody's word for it." It was a quiet rebellion, not of swords, but of reason. Medicine, too, began to evolve, though more slowly. Ancient texts still guided much of practice, but new anatomies, dissections, and clinical observations began to shift understandings of the body. William Harvey's discovery of blood circulation challenged centuries of medical teaching. The heart, once imagined as a furnace or seat of the soul, became instead a pump, mechanical, rhythmic, knowable. The change was not just in what was learned, but in how learning itself was pursued. Through bodies observed, experiments repeated, notes taken with careful hands. These thinkers were not always heroes, nor free from error. They worked within the constraints of their time, often deeply religious, sometimes alchemists or astrologers, as well as scientists. The boundary between magic and science was still porous, and many minds stood, with one foot in each world. But within their slow, methodical efforts was a new confidence. The belief that nature could be understood through its own patterns, not merely through ancient texts or divine mystery. And outside the halls of study, ordinary people observed the world too. Mariners charted currents and stars, farmers tracked seasons and soils, midwives noted signs and symptoms with care born of necessity. Though unrecorded, their insights formed a quiet undercurrent to the more celebrated discoveries of the age. Knowledge was everywhere, in the tools of craftsmen, the recipes of herbalists, the chants of navigators. The scientific revolution did not replace older wisdoms overnight. It grew alongside them, borrowing, testing, reshaping. By century's end, the world had not transformed all at once. Most people still lived by the light of fire, healed with herbs, and measured time by the sun's position. But something had shifted. A lens had been turned. A method had been tested. And beneath the noise of war, famine, and collapse, the quiet voice of reason had begun to speak more clearly. As we move onward from this awakening, we return to the currents of commerce and exploration, to the growing entanglement of peoples and places once thought distant. The next chapter carries us across oceans and over mountain passes, tracing silver, spices, and silk through the growing web of global trade, and showing how the 17th century, despite its pain, quietly wove the world together in ways that would never again unravel. Beneath the seemingly disconnected struggles of empires and villages, wars and famines, something else was slowly knitting the world together. It did not arrive with trumpets or declarations, but with ledgers, ocean winds, and the quiet patience of merchants. In the 17th century, trade routes, old and new, began to braid across the globe, forming a web so intricate and persistent that no corner of the world would remain untouched. This was not yet globalization as we know it, but it was its foundation, a gentle tightening of distant threads that would change what people ate, wore, believed, and feared. At the center of this tightening web was silver, mined from the high altitudes of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and from Japanese mountains, then funneled across oceans in staggering quantities. Spanish galleons carried it from the Americas to Manila, where Chinese merchants eagerly exchanged silk, porcelain, and tea. From there, silver flowed into the Ming and later Qing economies, becoming the lifeblood of tax systems and market transactions. Chinese goods, in turn, filled European homes with new colors and textures, delicate blue and white ceramics, embroidered robes, lacquered boxes. The path from an Andean mine to a Dutch dining room may have taken months, but it became almost routine, a hidden thread in the fabric of everyday life. Europe, for its part, was still learning how to manage these currents. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, and the English East India Company, chartered 2 years earlier, became sprawling corporate empires. They built fortified outposts, negotiated treaties, fought small wars, and controlled spice production in Southeast Asia with ruthless precision. Nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon, once luxuries available only in royal courts, now passed through merchant hands and middle-class kitchens. The cost of this expansion was often borne by others, local populations displaced, coerced or confined to single-crop economies designed to feed foreign appetites. In West Africa, textiles, guns, and beads arrived in exchange for gold and, increasingly, people. In the Americas, sugar, tobacco, and indigo left port cities in the hulls of ships bound for Europe, their production dependent on enslaved labor. The triangular trade began to shape oceans not just as distances to be crossed, but as highways of extraction and exchange. Though few individuals ever traveled far, their fates were now linked to places they had never seen. A famine in Bengal might ripple through Dutch spice prices. A mine collapse in Potosi could affect the silver supply in Beijing. Even within Europe, the flow of goods began to reshape domestic habits. Coffee arrived from Arabia, chocolate from Mesoamerica, tea from China. These new tastes, exotic and bitter, became rituals, consumed first in elite salons, then in broader circles. Coffee houses emerged as social centers, places where news, gossip, and ideas were shared alongside steaming cups. Each sip, carried with it the trace of distant soil and unseen hands, though few paused to consider the journey. This expanding web did not only move commodities, it carried ideas. Books crossed borders in translation. Letters traveled between Jesuits in Beijing and philosophers in Paris. Missionaries sought converts, traders sought markets. In some cases, they were the same person. Catholic orders like the Jesuits adapted local customs in places like China and Japan, engaging in deep cultural exchanges while also preaching their faith. Sometimes they were welcomed, sometimes expelled, but their presence marked a subtle shift, a recognition that the world was no longer composed of isolated domains, but overlapping circles of influence and curiosity. Maps too began to change. Once filled with sea monsters and sacred mountains, they grew more precise, more detailed. Coastlines sharpened. Interior spaces were filled in with cautious guesses and merchant trails. Globes appeared in private studies. The Earth was becoming something one could imagine in its entirety, vast but knowable, mysterious but connected. And with this imagining came a slow redefinition of human identity, not only as subjects of kingdoms, but as participants in a shared, if unequal, world. But these connections brought friction as well as fusion. Where trade flowed, so too did disease, conflict, and displacement. The expansion of commerce often meant the contraction of autonomy for those drawn into its currents. In Southeast Asia, local kingdoms struggled to maintain control over spice-producing islands. In the Americas, indigenous peoples were pushed to the margins of a system that viewed land as a resource rather than a relation. In West Africa, societies reoriented themselves around export economies with unpredictable consequences. And yet, within these shifts, there remained space for adaptation. African weavers incorporated European beads into traditional patterns. Japanese artisans copied and reimagined Dutch paintings. Chinese porcelain was made to fit European tastes, down to the shape of the teacups. Trade was not simply the spread of one culture over another, but a complicated dance of exchange, resistance, and reinvention. Nothing passed unchanged. The 17th century's global web did not glisten with perfection. It was often tangled, violent, and unjust. But it connected, in ways both visible and hidden, the lives of shepherds in Anatolia, merchants in Antwerp, potters in Jingdezhen, and slaves in Barbados. It set the stage for the modern world, not through a single transformation, but through countless small adjustments. A different spice in the soup, a foreign coin in a market, a whispered tale of another land passed down at a fireside. As we near the final chapters of this journey, we begin to sense the long exhale of the century. The worst storms in many places have passed, but the scars remain. The next section draws us gently toward that quieter ending, not a return to normalcy, but the soft settling of dust after the upheaval. A century that began in motion now drifts towards stillness, and in that stillness we find the beginning of something new. By the final years of the 1600s, the noise had not ceased entirely, but it had quieted. The wars that once raged with ceaseless fury now burned lower, banked behind treaties and exhaustion. The worst of the famines, though not forgotten, had passed in many places, replaced by cautious harvests and new patterns of resilience. The skies, once choked with ash and strange chill, seemed more forgiving. And though much of the century had felt like an unraveling, its last decades brought a kind of settling. Not peace in the modern sense, but a softer rhythm, as if the world itself was catching its breath. In Central Europe, the Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, had brought an end to the 30 Years' War, though its effects would ripple for generations. Borders were redrawn, power balances renegotiated, and sovereignty, the right of rulers to control their lands without external interference, became a cornerstone of diplomacy. The continent, bloodied and thinned, began the slow process of reconstitution. Fields were cleared once more. Bells that had long been silent rang out again. A generation of children grew up not knowing the taste of war, though their parents still bore its memory in their eyes. In England, after decades of civil war, regicide, and the brief experiment of a republic, the monarchy had returned, altered, trimmed of absolutism, and wary of excess. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, bloodless in name if not in cause, established the primacy of Parliament over Crown. It was not a revolution of mobs and barricades, but of contracts and declarations, a sign that even in a century so marked by chaos, new systems could emerge with a measure of restraint. Elsewhere in Europe, a similar recalibration unfolded. In France, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, had built his court at Versailles into a theatre of power, dazzling in image, precise in choreography. His reign, though absolute, brought administrative centralization and cultural prestige. Yet even he, in his later years, would face the limits of ambition, as costly wars strained the treasury and peasant discontent stirred beneath the glitter. The century ended with empire intact, but not unchallenged. In Asia, the Qing dynasty had secured its hold over China. The initial turbulence following the fall of the Ming gave way to a new order, conservative, structured, and increasingly confident. The Kangxi Emperor, who reigned for over 60 years, embodied this transition. A ruler of learning and military skill who embraced Confucian ideals while strengthening borders and overseeing a flourishing of art, science, and cartography. The trauma of conquest had not disappeared, but the dynasty had found its rhythm and the empire its direction. Japan, under the Tokugawa shogunate, remained largely closed to the world, but internally, it experienced what few other nations could claim in this era: sustained peace. Samurai who once roamed battlefields now managed ledgers. Farmers cultivated rice under systems of obligation that grew more stable, if sometimes more rigid. Poetry and painting quietly thrived. The Edo period would stretch on for another 150 years, but its soft foundations had already taken root. Across the Atlantic, however, the gears of colonial expansion turned ever faster. The Caribbean was now a patchwork of European plantations, worked by enslaved Africans under brutal regimes of sugar production. In North America, English, Dutch, French, and Spanish settlements expanded slowly, sometimes through trade, often through violence. Indigenous resistance remained potent, but increasingly fragmented. Treaties were signed, then broken. Lands were taken, stories silenced, yet survival endured in forms both seen and unseen. In West Africa, the Atlantic trade continued to distort traditional structures, drawing more societies into a web of export economies tied to slavery. Yet kingdoms adapted, resisted, and recalibrated their place within the shifting tides. Power moved inland, then back to the coast, carried by guns, gold, and grief. The century ended not with resolution, but with momentum, a deepening of patterns that would harden in the centuries ahead. The end of the 17th century also brought a subtle shift in thought. New ideas about the natural world, government, and human behavior began to circulate more widely. Locke's theories of liberty and property, Newton's mathematical laws, and the early whisperings of Enlightenment inquiry all suggested that something was beginning to stir, a shift from divine certainties to human possibilities. These ideas would not fully bloom until later, but their roots were already reaching into the minds of students, merchants, and even some monarchs. Still, for most people, the weavers, shepherds, servants, and scribes, the end of the century came not with philosophical treatises, but with the gentle return of routine. A winter without war, a harvest that fed a village through to spring, a child born after years of plague whose name carried hope. These were the markers of ending, small, quiet, and infinitely precious. Time does not close centuries with ceremony. The turning of 1699 into 1700 brought no parades, no universal recognition. In many parts of the world, calendars did not even align, but something had shifted. A century that had begun with fires in cities, fields, and mines ended with embers. And though the ashes were still warm, the silence that followed them was, in some places, the first in living memory. As we prepare to leave this century behind, one last chapter remains. A moment of reflection, of echoes, of lessons whispered rather than declared. The final section of this journey will not look forward with predictions, but backward with soft reverence, tracing how the quiet catastrophes and quiet triumphs of the 1600s shaped the world we now inhabit, often without our knowing. Long after the fires died down and the battles were forgotten, the 17th century continued to murmur beneath the surface of the world. Its wounds healed unevenly, its stories faded into folklore or footnotes, but its traces remained, in the way cities were rebuilt, in the rhythm of trade, in the expectations carried silently by nations and people alike. Though few pause to recall this century by name, its echoes drift quietly through the centuries that followed, shaping lives and choices in ways too subtle to chart. It was not a century that ended with glory, but one that left behind the shape of resilience, worn, weathered, but unbroken. What lingered most from this long and heavy time was not the grandeur of empire or the sound of cannon fire, but the human instinct to continue, to adapt in small ways, to carry grief without letting it consume everything. In the German forests, where war had once raged like wildfire, towns grew back in the cracks of old ruins. Bells were re-hung in belfries long silent. Children played where soldiers had once marched. In China, the shock of dynastic change gave way to a new dynasty's order, and farmers returned to the land with quiet resolve, rice seedlings once again cupped in calloused hands. In Japan, peace continued its long experiment, refining beauty from stillness and routine. The century's survivors had lived through a world of instability, of collapsing climates, of wandering soldiers, of foreign diseases and shifting gods. They had watched the sky grow strange, the soil grow poor, the powerful grow distant or cruel. And yet, they had also watched neighbors share grain during famine, watched midwives deliver babies in candlelit rooms despite plague at the door, watched songs be rewritten in the ruins of churches. Even in devastation, community persisted. Even in collapse, the fabric of life was rewoven. The empires that rose from this age carried its memory in their bones. The Qing in China, the Tokugawa in Japan, the Bourbon Court in France, the English Parliament, all were shaped by the century's tests. They became more cautious, more centralized, more attentive to the boundaries of power and the burden of rule. The world had grown both larger and more fragile, and in that fragile vastness, people began to think differently about the natural world, about rights, about the structure of time itself. The 17th century's disasters had scattered knowledge and belief like dust in wind. Yet that scattering made room for rearrangement. The seeds of enlightenment were sown here, not in times of peace, but in the confusion that demanded new understanding. The birth of science, the reformation of government, the global trading web, all bore the fingerprints of the century's strain. Ideas took root in the soil, turned over by collapse. What seemed like endings were in truth beginnings, spoken softly in new vocabularies. We live today in the world that century quietly made, in the borders drawn during treaties, in the scientific language still in use, in the echoes of colonial patterns still felt in economies and cultures across the globe. Even our sense of time, standardized, measured, abstract, began to crystallize during those years of reconstruction and order-making. A planet that once spun in isolated rhythms had been nudged into a shared, if uneven, motion. But even more than structures, it is the emotional legacy of the 1600s that remains. The knowledge that everything can shift, and yet life will continue. That the coldest winters end. That silence after plague can be filled again with song. that people in their simplest forms are endlessly adaptive. They learn, they grieve, they try again, and in doing so they make history not through conquest, but through continuation. Perhaps this is why the 17th century is so often forgotten. It resists clean stories. It offers no single hero, no climactic moment of triumph. Instead, it gives us fragments. Frost-bitten fields, broken treaties, prayers whispered under siege, a mother handing a child a bowl of thin porridge, a merchant carving numbers into a wooden ledger beneath flickering lamplight. It gives us the quiet dignity of survival. And for those who listen closely, it gives us perspective on the fragility of stability, on the depth of patience, on how the world we know was shaped not just by action, but by endurance. So we end not with a flourish, but with a breath. A long, slow exhale. The 1600s pass behind us like mist over distant hills, not forgotten, but absorbed. They remind us that history is not always loud, that transformation can be slow, and that the most profound changes are often the ones that unfold gently across lifetimes. Let this memory settle softly as you rest. Let the stillness of the past offer calm to the present. And as the century closes, so too may your eyes, carried not by the noise of history, but by the hush it leaves behind.